Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, settle into that one spot on the couch that finally feels right, and let the frantic hum of the modern world just dissolve. We're going to take a very long, very slow, and arguably very humid walk through one of the most ambitious and spectacularly doomed projects in history. We're going to talk about a time when a tiny, rugged nation, Scotland, decided it was going to become a global colonial superpower by building a trading hub in a place that was essentially a wall of mosquitoes and malaria. This is the story of the Darien scheme, a moment when an entire country's life savings were traded for a dream of tropical gold, only to end up buried in the mud of Panama. So, get comfortable, adjust your blankets, and let's float back to a time when the key to the world turned out to be a very expensive door to nowhere. Now, to understand why Scotland decided to gamble everything on a strip of jungle, we have to look at the state of things in the late 1690s. Scotland was in a bit of a funk. They were in a personal union with England, meaning they shared a king, but they weren't the same country yet. England had the East India Company. They had colonies in the Americas, and they were getting very, very rich. Scotland, meanwhile, was dealing with a series of failed harvests, known as the Seven Ill Years. People were hungry, the economy was stagnant, and there was a palpable sense of new colony envy. Enter William Paterson. Now, Paterson was a man of big ideas. He was actually one of the founders of the Bank of England, so he had some street cred when it came to money. His big pitch was simple, elegant, and on paper, absolutely brilliant. He pointed at the Isthmus of Panama, a narrow strip of land connecting North and South America. He called it the door of the seas and the key of the universe. He argued that if Scotland built a colony there, they could create a land bridge for trade. Instead of ships sailing all the way around the dangerous tip of South America, they could just unload at Darien, carry the goods across the jungle, and reload on the other side. Scotland would become the middleman for the entire world's trade. It was a brilliant plan, provided you completely ignored the existence of the Spanish Empire, the local climate, and the fact that 17th century medicine was basically just hope you don't get a fever. The Scottish public didn't just buy into the idea, they went into a collective frenzy. Because the English government, pressured by the East India Company, forbade English investors from putting money into the project, the Scots decided to fund it themselves. And when I say they funded it, I mean they really funded it. People from every walk of life, Highland chiefs, lowland merchants, widows, even servants, poured their life savings into the Company of Scotland. They raised about £400,000, which was estimated to be between 1/4 and 1/2 of all the liquid wealth in the entire country. It was a national crusade. If you didn't invest in Darien, you weren't just a bad businessman, you were practically a traitor. They were building a new Caledonia, a Scottish paradise in the tropics. Of course, nobody in Edinburgh really knew what a tropical jungle was like. They packed the ships with things they thought would be useful for trade: heavy wool blankets, thick woolen stockings, and my personal favorite, thousands of English-language Bibles to trade with the local indigenous populations, who, of course, spoke neither English nor had a burning desire for Scottish theology. Because why wouldn't a person living in 90-degree humidity want a thick wool sweater and a book they can't read? In July 1698, the first expedition set sail from Leith. 5 ships, 1,200 people, and the hopes of an entire nation. The departure was a massive celebration. People lined the shores, cheering and weeping. They were convinced that when these ships returned, they would be low in the water with gold, silver, and spices. The voyage took 4 months. By the time they reached the coast of Panama in November 1698, the reality of the key of the universe began to set in. It wasn't a lush paradise ready for commerce. It was a dense, impenetrable mangrove swamp. The heat was oppressive, the humidity was like a wet blanket, and the ground was essentially a soup of rotting vegetation. They cleared some land and built a fort, which they named Fort St. Andrew. They started a town called New Edinburgh, but the door of the seas refused to open. The soil was too poor for the crops they brought. The local indigenous people, the Guna, were friendly enough, but they didn't really want the wool stockings or the Bibles. And then the fever arrived. Dysentery and yellow fever began to rip through the camp. People were dying at the rate of 10 or 12 a day. The paradise was becoming a graveyard. To make matters worse, the English king, William III, had issued a proclamation forbidding the English colonies in Jamaica and the Caribbean from providing any food or assistance to the Scots. He didn't want to upset the Spanish, who claimed the territory of Darien as their own. The Scots were alone, starving and rotting in the sun. In June 1699, less than a year after they arrived, the survivors decided to abandon the colony. They were so weak that they could barely weigh anchor. Out of 1,200 who had set out, only a few hundred made it back to Scotland. But here's the kicker. Because communications were so slow in the 1700s, a second expedition of 1,300 people was already on its way. They arrived at New Edinburgh only to find a ghost town of abandoned huts and shallow graves. Instead of turning around, they decided to try again. Because why not double down on a disaster? So, the first expedition to Darien had dissolved into a nightmare of fever and desperation. The survivors limping back to Scotland, their dreams of tropical gold replaced by the chilling memory of a swamp that ate men whole. But as we discussed, in the slow, uncertain world of the late 17th century, news traveled at the speed of a sailing ship, which meant it was often too late. And so an entire second wave of hope, ignorance, and wool blankets was already on its way. In August 1699, 2 ships carrying the first wave of the second expedition arrived at the deserted site of New Edinburgh. They found the remains of the fort, the abandoned huts, and the haunting, silent evidence of the first group's demise. A sane person might have seen this and thought, perhaps this isn't the key to the universe after all. But these were Scots, fueled by a mixture of national pride, stubbornness, and the deep, deep pockets of every hopeful merchant and impoverished widow back home. They decided to press on. Over the next few months, more ships arrived, bringing another 1,300 settlers. They were horrified by what they found: the graves, the disease, the sheer inhospitable nature of the jungle. Many immediately wanted to leave, but the directors of the company, who arrived with this second wave, were adamant. They had invested too much. The nation had invested too much. Failure was not an option. Because why let a few hundred dead bodies get in the way of a perfectly good colonial dream? They tried to rebuild. They tried to plant crops, but the soil was still terrible. The heat and humidity were relentless, and inevitably, the diseases returned with a vengeance. Dysentery, malaria, and yellow fever once again swept through the camp. People were dying faster than they could bury them. The second expedition was quickly becoming an even larger, more tragic replica of the first. But this time, there was another problem. The Spanish, who had been watching the Scottish intrusion with growing anger, decided they'd had enough. They had always claimed Darien as their territory, and now they were going to do something about it. In February 1700, a large Spanish force numbering around 1,500 men laid siege to Fort St. Andrew. The Scots, weakened by disease and starvation, put up a desperate fight. They were starving, dehydrated, and dying of illness, but they were not going to give up without a struggle. For a month, they held out, repelling several Spanish assaults. But it was a futile gesture. They were completely cut off. The English colonies in the Caribbean, under strict orders from King William III, who was desperately trying to avoid a war with Spain, refused to send any aid, food, or medical supplies. The Scots were completely on their own. On March 31st, 1700, the last remaining Scottish commander, a man named Alexander Campbell of Finnab, realizing the situation was hopeless, negotiated a surrender. The Scots were allowed to leave with their arms and colors, but they had to abandon the colony for good. They were given a few days to gather their few possessions and sail away. The journey home was another disaster. Many of the ships were so poorly manned by sick and dying sailors that they simply drifted, lost at sea. Others sank in storms. Of the roughly 2,500 people who had sailed for Darien in both expeditions, only a few hundred ever made it back to Scotland. The vast majority perished in the jungle, at sea, or from the diseases they brought back with them. The return of the surviving ships was not met with cheers, but with a profound national grief. The scale of the loss was staggering. Every village, every town, every family in Scotland had lost someone, a son, a brother, a husband, or their entire life savings. The Company of Scotland was completely bankrupt. The dream of a global trading empire had turned into a financial black hole. This catastrophic failure had immense and lasting consequences for Scotland. The country was utterly ruined, financially and emotionally. There was a desperate need for funds, for stability, for some way to recover from this national trauma. And this, ultimately, led to one of the most significant and controversial moments in Scottish history, the Act of Union with England in 1707. The English, seeing Scotland's desperation, offered a deal. They would take on Scotland's national debt, effectively bailing the country out, and in return, Scotland would give up its parliament and become part of Great Britain. It was a bitter pill for many Scots to swallow. The country had, in essence, been bought. The Darien scheme, meant to secure Scotland's independence and prosperity, ended up costing the nation its sovereignty. As we leave the humid, forgotten grave of New Edinburgh and the echoing, empty counting houses in Edinburgh, just feel the weight of that quiet despair. The dream of the key to the universe has rusted away. The Scottish ships lie at the bottom of the sea, and the nation itself has changed forever. So Scotland had, quite literally, bought a one-way ticket to financial ruin and a forced political marriage, all in the name of a tropical trade hub that turned out to be a malarial nightmare. It's a rather stark reminder that sometimes a good map is more important than a good marketing slogan. But as we've seen, human beings are remarkably quick to forget a painful lesson, especially when there's the whiff of easy money in the air. While Scotland was licking its wounds, another nation was gearing up for its own grand financial experiment, one that would make Darien look like a modest backyard barbecue. We're floating back across the English Channel, then south into the glittering, slightly desperate halls of 18th century Paris. We're going to talk about the Mississippi Scheme, a story where the gold was entirely in the imagination, and the king was a very charming, very dangerous Scottish gambler. It's 1715, and France is in a bit of a mess. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, has finally, mercifully died. He'd ruled for 72 years, building Versailles, fighting endless wars, and generally making sure France was the most powerful, glittering nation in Europe. The problem was, all that glory came with an absolutely staggering price tag. When Louis XIV died, he left France with a national debt so enormous it was practically its own mountain range. The treasury was empty, the country was bankrupt, and the people were exhausted, because when you build palaces out of solid gold, someone eventually has to pay for it, and that someone was usually the increasingly taxed and unimpressed common folk. Enter John Law. Now, John Law was not your typical financial advisor. He was a Scottish bon vivant, a mathematical genius, a gambler, and not insignificantly, a convicted murderer who had fled England after killing a man in a duel over a one-in. So, just a regular guy you'd trust with the national treasury. Law's big idea was simple, elegant, and, on paper, revolutionary. He believed that money didn't need to be gold or silver. He believed money could be whatever we all agreed it was, specifically paper. He argued that if a nation issued paper money, backed by the promise of its future wealth, it could stimulate the economy and pay off its debts without relying on scarce precious metals. He managed to convince the regent of France, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, that his plan was the solution to France's debt crisis. In 1716, Law was allowed to establish the Banque Générale, a private bank that issued paper banknotes. And for a little while, it actually worked. The paper money was more convenient than hauling around heavy bags of coins, and it stimulated trade. The French economy started to breathe again. Because let's be honest, who doesn't like a bit of paper that magically turns into something useful? But Law had bigger plans. In 1717, he created the Compagnie de la Louisiane, later renamed the Compagnie d'Occident, or simply the Mississippi Company. This company was granted an exclusive monopoly on trade with the vast, unexplored French territories in North America, specifically the Louisiana Territory. Now, the reality of Louisiana at the time was that it was mostly just a vast, humid swamp filled with alligators, mosquitoes, and a few scattered trading posts. It was hardly a bustling center of commerce unless you were a particularly ambitious mosquito. But Law was a master of marketing. He began to paint a picture of Louisiana that was less swamp and more literal El Dorado. He circulated incredible stories of mountains made of solid gold, rivers paved with emeralds, and a climate so perfect that the crops practically harvested themselves. He claimed that the native populations were eager to trade vast quantities of furs and precious metals. It was a fantastical vision, a dream of endless wealth just waiting to be tapped, provided you ignored all geographical and anthropological realities. The French public, desperate for a ray of hope after years of war, poverty, and national gloom, absolutely swallowed it. They were captivated by the promise of exotic riches from a far-off land. They began to trade their dwindling gold and silver coins for Law's paper money, and then use that paper money to buy shares in the Mississippi Company. The demand for these shares was so intense that the Rue de Quincampoix, a narrow street in Paris where the shares were traded, became the frenzied heart of the new financial universe. People would wait for days, jostling for position in the chaotic street just for the chance to buy a few shares. Stories from the time described dukes and duchesses disguising themselves as servants just to get a spot in the long lines, eager to buy into the latest sensation. The frenzy became so extreme that a clever, opportunistic humpbacked man reportedly made a fortune simply by renting out his back as a writing surface for traders to sign their contracts. Because why not monetize a physical deformity when there's a bubble to be inflated and desperation is high? The share prices didn't just climb, they skyrocketed. In early 1719, a share in the Mississippi Company might cost around 500 livres. By the end of the year, it was worth an astonishing 10,000 livres. People became millionaires, a term actually coined and popularized during this very craze. A simple seamstress or a lowly footman might suddenly be wealthier than an old noble family, all on the strength of a few slips of paper that represented ownership in a vast, mostly unexplored swamp. John Law himself became the most powerful man in France. He was appointed Controller General of Finances, practically running the entire country. He was hailed as a genius, a savior who had magically turned paper into prosperity. The entire nation seemed to be operating on a collective high, convinced that the good times would never end, and the gold of Louisiana would soon be flooding into the streets of Paris. To keep the illusion going, he even staged that famous, slightly pathetic parade where he hired thousands of Parisian beggars, gave them shiny new shovels, and marched them through the streets, telling everyone they were miners heading off to harvest the emeralds of the Mississippi. Of course, once the parade was over and the crowds went home, most of those miners sold their shovels for a glass of wine and disappeared back into the slums. They never even saw a ship, let alone a swamp. Meanwhile, the financial engineering was getting truly surreal. To keep the stock price moving up, Law's bank, now the official Banque Royale, just kept printing paper money. If people needed cash to buy more shares, Law gave them the cash. It was a closed loop of insanity. The more paper he printed, the more the shares cost. The more the shares cost, the richer everyone felt. But inflation was starting to rear its ugly head. The price of bread, meat, and rent in Paris began to skyrocket because there was so much paper money floating around and so few actual goods. By early 1720, the smart money started to get an itch at the back of its neck. A few high-ranking nobles, like the Prince de Conti, decided it was time to cash out. Conti sent 3 wagons to Law's bank to demand that his paper shares be converted into actual gold and silver coins. Law was furious. This was a betrayal of the system, but he had to comply. When the public saw wagons full of gold leaving the bank, the seed of doubt was finally planted. The doubt turned into a chill, and the chill turned into a full-blown frost. People started to realize that you couldn't eat a Mississippi share, and you couldn't pay your landlord in potential emeralds. In May 1720, Law tried to devalue the shares and the paper money by half to bring them closer to reality. It was an honest move in a dishonest game, and it was a disaster. The public didn't see a market correction, they saw the end of the world. The Rue de Quincampoix, which had been a place of dreams, became a place of nightmares. The crowds were so dense and so angry that people were literally crushed against the walls to death. The bank runs were constant. Thousands of people stood outside the Bank Royale in the summer heat, clutching their paper notes, demanding the gold that Law had promised was there. But the vaults were empty. The gold was a ghost. Law's transition from savior of France to most hated man in the world happened in a matter of weeks. He was attacked in his carriage. He had to hide in the royal palace to avoid being torn apart by the mob. By December 1720, the man who owned half of France fled across the border into Brussels, disguised and penniless, leaving behind a nation that was physically and emotionally shattered. As we leave the angry streets of Paris and the silent, empty bank vaults, just feel the weight of that realization. The paper is just paper. The shovels are gone. The miners are back in the gutters, and the dream of the Mississippi has dissolved into the mist. So, France had effectively burned its financial house down to stay warm with paper money, and John Law was currently peering out of a carriage window at the French border, probably wondering where it all went wrong, and perhaps looking for a card game to pass the time. But as we've seen in this little tour of human frailty, madness is remarkably contagious. Across the English Channel, the British had been watching the French millionaires with a mixture of suspicion and, more importantly, intense, burning jealousy. They decided that if the French could get rich off a swamp, the English could certainly get rich off a sea. We are floating into London now, specifically into the narrow, smoke-filled labyrinth of Exchange Alley. It's 1720, the same year the French bubble popped, but in London, the party was just getting started. The guest of honor was the South Sea Company. Now, the South Sea Company was essentially a mirror image of Law's Mississippi scheme. They were granted a monopoly on trade with the South Seas, which was just a fancy way of saying South America. The pitch was identical: gold, silver, and exotic riches beyond your wildest dreams. The slight problem, and there's always a slight problem, isn't there, was that Spain actually owned South America, and Spain was not exactly in the habit of letting British merchant ships wander into their ports to fill up on silver. The monopoly was essentially a permission slip to visit a place you weren't allowed to enter. But the directors of the South Sea Company were masters of the "don't look at the man behind the curtain" school of business. They didn't talk about Spanish galleons or naval blockades. They talked about the vibe of wealth. To make the stock even more attractive, the company offered to take over Britain's national debt. It was a massive shell game. The government felt better because the debt was gone, and the public felt better because the government was backing the company. It was a loop of confidence that had no actual floor. By the summer of 1720, South Sea shares had shot up from £128 to over £1,000. London went into a state of collective delirium that made the French craze look restrained. It wasn't just the professional traders, it was the entire social fabric. Ladies-in-waiting, bishops, poets, and even the king's mistresses were pouring their gold into South Sea stock. This was the era of the Change Alley frenzy. The coffee houses, like Jonathan's and Garraway's, became the temples of this new religion of greed. But the truly weird part, the part that really makes you want to pull the duvet a little higher, was the bubble companies that grew in the South Sea's shadow. Because the main company was doing so well, hundreds of smaller, increasingly absurd companies started popping up to catch the crumbs of the public's cash. This is where we get into the peak of 18th century snark. There was a company formed to import jackasses from Spain, because clearly England didn't have enough of them already. There was a company for a wheel for perpetual motion, which is a great investment if you plan on living forever and don't mind violating the laws of thermodynamics. There was even a company to furnish funerals to any part of Great Britain, which in hindsight was probably the most honest business plan of the bunch. But the absolute winner, the gold medalist of the bubble era, was the company famously advertised as for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Think about that for a second. The promoter literally told people, "Give me your money and I won't tell you what I'm doing with it." And people did. He opened his office in the morning, collected £2,000 in deposits, a fortune at the time, and by the time the sun went down, he had closed the door and disappeared forever. He was the only person who actually made a great advantage out of that undertaking. Even Sir Isaac Newton, the man who literally figured out how gravity works, couldn't resist the pull of the bubble. He invested, sold for a profit, saw his friends getting even richer, and then bought back in at the absolute top. He lost £20,000, millions in today's money. He famously said, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." It's comforting in a way to know that even the smartest man in history can be a complete disaster with his 401k. The end, when it came, was just as brutal as it was in Paris. The South Sea directors started selling their own shares, the secret got out, and the wind trade turned into a hurricane. By September 1720, the stock was in freefall. People who were planning to buy dukedoms in August were looking for work as street sweepers in October. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was sent to the Tower of London, and the country was left with a financial hangover that lasted for decades. As we leave the quiet, bankrupt coffee houses of London, just feel the weight of the silence. The jackasses haven't arrived, the perpetual motion wheel has stopped, and the undertaking of great advantage is just a memory in a dusty ledger. The night is cold, the fog is thick over the Thames, the bubbles have all burst, and the world is suddenly very, very quiet. Everything is still.